Okay, so this might perhaps be a weird place to start. I mean, if you've signed up to a photography course, then you probably have an idea of, what photography means to you, or at least have an understanding of it, right? But we're gonna start with the very basics so that everyone has the same level playing field to work from. And, you might think that you're too good for such a basic question, but stay with me. You might just find something interesting here. So, photography, the act of taking pictures, clicking shutters, pointing and shooting. It's easy to understand what's happening by your actions, but when we break down photography into its atomic constituents, what exactly does it equate to? The word photography in Greek quite literally means drawing with a light. Phos, which means a light, and graphe, which means drawing or writing. This idea of drawing with light is at the very core of what photography is. As photographers, what we do is we record a moment in time with light. Now, in the past, we used to use film, which is an acetate or a polyester strip coated with a gelatin emulsion which contained silver halide crystals which were sensitive to particular spectrums of light. Now, when they were exposed to light, the coating would then react and then cause a chemical change depending on if the light was absorbed by the teeny crystals in the film or not. And we call this an exposure, very key word to understand here, as in an exposure to light, in which we flash the real world onto these pieces of film very, very rapidly, causing an imprint of the world due to that chemical reaction. The interesting thing about this chemical reaction is that it would last and persist on whatever surface or media it was imprinted on, allowing it to be made physical and therefore shared and distributed. This was light turned into something that was shown to others or able to be shown to others. And over the ages, while the process and the meaning of photography has shifted over time, at its core, photography is and always will be about the observation and the recording of light. After all, everything that we see with our human eyes is effectively light. Highlights, shadows, whites, darks, and everything in between. It's all either light or an absence of it. Understand that the idea of how good you are at photography is, in fact, how good you are at observing the quality of light and your ability to record it. Over time, photography has morphed into many things. Some people use photography as a documentation of a moment in time. Some people use photography to take visual notes. Some people use photography as a form of expression and art. And now that photography is no longer on film and is now completely digital, photography has many uses in the modern age. But again, the core idea has not changed. Photography is still about the observation and the recording of light. In this course, we'll be talking about photography in a more expressive and artistic sense, but that doesn't mean that using photography to just take snapshots or reminders of things is any less important than the purpose that we're trying to pursue over the next 30 days. It's all a part of the power of photography, and it's in the harnessing of this entire spectrum of understanding that we can truly be well-informed photographers. Now let's get an understanding of the makeup of a camera and how it records light and then transforms that onto an image. So this is a modern day digital camera. It has two main parts, what we refer to as the camera lens and the camera body. Now, the purpose of the camera body here is to do the actual recording of the images, right? At a base level, how this happens is that at the center, in the middle of this camera, there is a sensor. And this sensor is similar in action to how film used to work. This is the surface that the light gets exposed onto, and it's that light that gets recorded onto the sensor, then made digital, and then gets output as an image. Most of the time, without getting too technical, you can think of the sensor here as always being in the dark, right? The thing that controls the light, therefore, that eventually gets made to go onto the sensor is called the shutter. And the shutter in most modern day cameras is actually a combination of a top and bottom curtain that sits in front of the sensor and then opens up very, very quickly to let light through onto the sensor, but then closes very quickly as well. And it is this perfect amount of time, this super quick flash of light, that allows the perfect exposure or the perfect amount of light to reach the sensor, producing the image that we are looking for. This is kind of like when you are in the bedroom, right? And you've just woken up and it's dark and you open the door to go outside and it's super bright and you're blinded by all the light. And, that's just too much light for your eyes to handle in that moment. That transition between light and dark and opening up the door is what the shutter in the camera is also responsible for. So you can kind of see that as a metaphor. And this relationship between our human eyes and the two parts of the camera is actually an analogy that goes well and plays very well together. And this will make a little bit more sense in just a little bit. So now that we know the role and the function of what the camera body is, what about the second part? This thing, this big thing at the end here. This is the camera lens. And the camera lens is responsible for focusing and directing the light that then eventually will make its way onto the sensor. And this is, again, how our human eyes work as well. Inside of our eyes, we have the front of the eyes, the pupil, the lens, and the iris behind the cornea. They all serve to focus and direct the light to the back of the eye. This is similar to our camera lens. But then we have the retina and the optic nerve at the back of the eye that then interprets that light into the image and sends that into our brain for processing. And that is the camera body system. So the camera lens has a series of glass internals and what's called an aperture. The aperture is controlled by blades and it gets bigger and smaller. The larger the aperture, the more light it lets through the lens, and when the aperture is smaller instead, it obviously lets less light through. This aperture is one of the three key components to understanding what the perfect amount of light to let through is, but more on that idea in the coming days when we talk about exposure. So when we put a camera lens on a camera body, the lens controls what the body is looking at. It shapes and focuses the light that the camera body sees, and it also controls how big or how zoomed in the actual image itself is as well, and we call that the focal length. So with the lens and the body working together, we have two pieces of how a camera makes an image and how it shapes and focuses and directs light, and then how that light then gets recorded as an image. Now, of course, this is a very simplified explanation of all of these things, but hey, it's day one and I don't want to overload you too much just yet. Rest assured that as the days go by, especially in the upcoming few days, we'll go much, much deeper into how all of these things work together and how we can make the most out of these incredible pieces of technology. For now, let's talk about terminology because I'm going to be using some words that you may or may not know. So let's at least set ourselves a little baseline and a little foundational terminology moving forward. So on our camera body, we have the sensor, we have the shutter that goes in front of the sensor, we have the mount, which is the thing around the sensor that the lens goes onto. We then have the grip. We have the shutter button, which usually sits on top of that grip. We have the monitor, which is where you're able to see and preview the image on the back of the camera. We have the viewfinder, which is often a much higher resolution monitor for use with one single eye that we bring our eye to. We have all the dials at the back that you turn. We have the buttons that you press. We then have a hot shoe mount at the top, which we're able to attach certain accessories to. We then have a mounting hole at the bottom, which we're able to screw in accessories to as well. This is the battery door and the battery. Then we have all these bits of connectivity. And then on the other side, we have our card slots. Now on the lens itself, we have what's referred to as the front element. And then on the bottom of the lens, we have the rear element. And all of the bits of glass in between are called lens elements. Just inside the front element, we have the aperture, and the aperture is made by aperture blades that fan into a circle. This is the focusing ring. This is an aperture ring on a different lens. These are custom buttons and switches that we can use in order to change different settings on the lens itself. All right, that's all the basics for today's lesson. That was a lot. Let's move on with the first assignment for this course. So let's start off things easy with a little bit of history. So, photography has had a lot of progression since its invention in the 17th century. And along the way, there have been many, many innovations in the way that we record images, from box cameras and pinhole cameras to using mirrors and using chemicals, using films, and being in dark rooms and that red light kind of look. To garner an appreciation for just how far photography has come, today's assignment is simply just to research the history of photography and find something that actually ends up surprising you. Getting a good understanding of all of the different stages throughout the centuries that photography has come through will expose you to not only the pleasures of modern age technology by contrast, but it will also expose you to changes of the varying subject matter and what people chose to photograph in the past versus what they choose to photograph now. And if you feel like it, feel free to leave your idea of what surprised you in the comments of this video, and maybe something that someone else shared too will surprise you as well. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.